Jay Moore, thank you for being with us this afternoon.
Oh, thank you for having me, Sigrid.
So, I have some questions about your personal history in behavior analysis. So, how did you become a behavior analyst?
Well, in the galaxy a long time ago, I graduated from college in 1967, and I was fairly certain I wanted to go to graduate school. I hadn't been all that successful in getting in, so I was a resident of Michigan at the time, and so I applied to Western Michigan in Kalamazoo. I didn't know that they had a strongly behavioral program there, but I went there and began to take courses, and over the next year, or I was there for 2 years. The first year I concentrated mostly on some applied behavior analysis programs. And that was interesting to me, but the second year I began to work with a professor named Lyon, David Lyon, who was an experimental analyst, and so I shifted my interest from from applied behavior analysis to experimental behavior analysis, and I did a master's thesis on just pigeon responding in an operant chamber. And I began to see the value of it, and began to be, just basic research began to be very interesting to me. So I guess I had not had, as an undergraduate, I hadn't really had a great deal of exposure to behavior analysis. In the first year of graduate school in Kalamazoo, I was just sort of feeling my way around. But then during the second year, I kind of saw how everything fit together. And so it was probably during that second year that my interest really sort of crystallized, and I became more interested in behavior analysis. Now, it was after that second year that I had a military obligation to attend to. So I was in the Navy for 3 years, and I always knew that even when I was in the Navy, I wanted to go back to graduate school. I was still subscribing to JEB and things like that. They were getting mailed to me when I was in the Navy. So I had completed applications, and when I was released from active duty in the Navy 3 years later, I resumed graduate school for my doctoral work, and I continued on in experimental analysis of behavior, and so that's kind of my history and where I've been ever since.
So you have really grown up in a behavior analytic environment, grown up academically.
Well, yes, but concentrating on graduate school, I didn't have that much exposure as an undergraduate, but certainly in graduate school, the 2 graduate programs I went to, one in Kalamazoo, where I got my master's degree, and then where I got my doctoral degree, which is UC San Diego. They were both strongly behavioral programs.
So a question I have generally is, what was it like to be a behavior analyst at that time? So your experiences as a graduate student among behavior analysts are probably different from many people who were growing up in environments where there weren't many behavior analysts, but you probably also had a sense of what was going on in a larger field. So what was it like to be a behavior analyst in those times, in the 70s?
Well, when I started in the late 60s, I would say that the major emphasis, even in Kalamazoo, was toward applied work. They did have some experimental people there doing research, but by and large, it was shifting toward experimental work. So I did some behavior modification projects in an elementary school classroom, and was kind of knowledgeable about all these things. The Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis was just starting, so there was a lot of interest in applied work. Basic research was there as a presence, but I would say most of the emphasis, even in the late 60s, was trying to show the usefulness of behavior analysis in these applied settings, maybe with different populations, because that's the ones that people tended to work with. There was a state hospital that had a lot of in Kalamazoo, they had a lot of special education programs that were going on, and there was another residential facility at Fort Custer that was outside of Kalamazoo. So there was an awful lot of interest in applied behavior analysis in Kalamazoo back even then. When I returned to graduate school at UC San Diego, there was no real applied work that was going on there. It was all experimental work. There were 2 and then 3 experimental analysts of behavior that was there. George Reynolds was the most senior person, and my advisor was Ed Fantino. And then a year or so after I'd got there, Ben Williams joined, and they had, all 3 had research programs, basic research with pigeons in operant chambers, investigating various things for having to do with operant behavior, or schedules, or behavioral contrast, or choice, or things like that. So the emphasis at UCSD was entirely 100% on experimental work. There weren't any applied projects that anyone did. As that program there changed, it evolved over the, so by 1980, or into the 80s, they'd started to hire some applied folks who were working there. But that was well after I had left.
So, what of the things you've done as a behavior analyst, what would you most like to be remembered for? What have you done that you would feel like has made the most impact, or might make the most impact as future goes on?
Well, I've sort of had 2 major interests in behavior analysis. One is the experimental work that you do with pigeons and operant chambers and things, and the other one has been the theoretical, philosophical, and conceptual issues. My interest in that was stimulated largely by the person of Willard Day. Willard was a faculty member at University of Nevada in Reno. In the late 1960s, 1969, he published 2 articles in JAB that had this kind of philosophical orientation to them. And then in 1972, he started the journal then known as Behaviorism. And so there were a lot of articles that were being published showing the validity of behavior analysis as not just as a technology, but also having a lot of kind of scholarly integrity to it. And I was attracted to that. Skinner was writing articles and publishing books. He'd published Beyond Freedom and Dignity by that time, and shortly after that About Behaviorism came out, and he had his other kinds of articles that he was published in Cumulative Record, and his book Contingencies of Reinforcement, and of course there was always verbal behavior. So all of these things were out there, and they just all kind of worked together for me. I've tried to maintain my own interest in those 2 parts of behavior analysis, those 2 fields of behavior analysis, the experimental work and the TPC work, the theoretical work. So I guess if I wanted to be known for anything, it's how someone could perhaps make contributions in those 2 areas. You don't have to just focus in one area. You can kind of expand and do things in several different areas. However many articles you've published or something like that, I suppose, would be an index of something, or however many citations you have to particular articles or something. I don't know, I don't have any idea what those figures would be for any of the articles I'd published, but it's been sort of rewarding to me personally to be able to work in this field and to be able to contribute to the association, ABAI, in whatever capacities you get asked to serve as. We've served as presidents and committee chairs and things like that, so that's been rewarding too. So I guess the common phrase is, well, you did the best you had with the hand you were dealt. So I guess that would be my summary statement.
Ooh, good job. How do you think behavior analysis has changed over the years since the late 1960s?
Well, I think there's been a big sort of crystallization of what the interests are. Obviously, the proportional representation of the EAB work, experimental work versus applied work, has changed. I mean, I would say even back then it wasn't 50-50. Maybe it was, let's say, 55 applied and 45% experimental work, even in the late 60s. And now I think it's changed even more. It must be at least 75% applied work, or maybe 80% applied work, and 20 or 25% experimental work, basic basic research, not just with non-humans, but with humans. You can do basic research with humans as well. So I think there's been this big change toward the application. I don't see the two as being mutually exclusive. I do think that the field needs to be balanced with having compatible interests and not letting one or the other drive the field. They have to work together, if only because our public reception, most of us work at universities, and where we're part of the public domain. We're a social institution, and we're responsible to the society that we live in. So we need to demonstrate that we can make those kinds of contributions to society. Now, whether that's going to be in a child with autism, or a child with a developmental disability, or someone with traumatic brain injury, or just helping to teach typically developing kids in the classroom, teaching them to read or do math problems or something like that, that's fine. But behavioral principles have that relevance, and it doesn't matter whether it's in a special classroom, or typically a classroom with typically developing kids, or in a company that you want to improve the performance of the workforce, or the administrators, or the supervisors, or anything like that. The two can work together. It's kind of a continuous flow from the laboratory, where you're doing basic research. It's just this continuous flow to the world outside the laboratory. So I guess I would always like to argue in favor of keeping this balance in behavior analysis with the work from the laboratory, and it will flow into the world outside the laboratory.
Thank you. So, looking back over your career, if you had it to do over again, is there anything that you would do differently?
I think that if I had to do it differently, I would learn to program a computer earlier than I have. I wasted an awful lot of time in later parts of my career here trying to teach myself programming, or teaching myself a little bit more about the computer technology. Kids these days still seem to pick that up quite readily. I'll confess that it's never been easy. You have some background with trying to set up experiments and run experiments with hardware or software. And of course I've done that for, 40 years now. So you get quite used to that, but with the computer technology, it's so much easier and so much more convenient to do that. So I guess that's one single thing that I would like to, if I had it to do over again, starting in the 70s when the small computers became available, and the Apples and the Radio Shacks and those desktop computers became available. I should have seen the writing on the wall, and I should have started to teach myself programming back then, instead of waiting until I was at this advanced age to try to learn it now. Too many things interfere as you get older.
Is your sense, as you said that, it occurred to me that perhaps other people feel pretty much the same way as you do, and I'm wondering if it's because people didn't see that a computer would be relevant to their experimental work. They didn't see how it would make a difference. Is that right, or wrong?
Well, I think people did. It's just that they weren't sure how much of an advantage it was going to be. Those early computers were a little bit clumsy to work. If we think back about Apple IIs, for example, which were popular in the late 70s and things, they used to have to use a cassette tape recorder to record the program on, and the commands were very clumsy, and they were nowadays we would say that they were very slow, but back then they were lightning fast. It was kind of a challenge to learn how to use them and to come up with the technology to sort of interface them to an operant chamber, either for rats or pigeons or something, because they were just little things. I remember in one of our laboratories there was a problem with there's a computer, and then there's the the operant chamber, and then there's an interface device that sits between the two. And people were maintaining some familiar or some kind of continuity with the standard kind of operant conditioning technique. So they also had cumulative recorders. Well, cumulative recorders have have these coils in them, these that generate an electromagnetic force. And so when you had to reset a cumulative recorder or something, that would kind of generate this electromagnetic force that would activate the interface for the computer. And there were just little things like that that would make everything get kind of all sort of bollocksed up, and it was a problem. Now, people eventually resolved these things, and so it wasn't an insurmountable problem. But it was just little things like that, and you began to wonder, is this all worth it? Maybe I don't need to do this after all. But I think in hindsight, it would have been I should have started earlier than I did, working with modern technology.
Now, you have already said that you would like to see a balance in applied and experimental work. So leads to my next question pertaining to what areas of the field would you like to see more work in? So I'm going to narrow that in your case and ask you, in the experimental area, what areas do you feel like are ripe for exploration but are not really being explored very much or very often at this time?
Probably the biggest area for research is, for me, and the one that's I think would be helpful to grow, would be research that's done with human subjects, particularly in the area of verbal behavior. I don't necessarily mean the kind of thing like discourse analysis, but the stuff on stimulus equivalence and equivalence relations is really important, because it shows how unique language is to the human condition, and how it helps understand what it means to be human. And then once we understand a lot more about verbal behavior, we can go a lot further with using that in the classroom when we're instructors, and most of us are teachers in one capacity or another. If we aren't teachers in a formal classroom of kids or of college students, then we may be instructors to our own children or whoever we happen to be living with at the time, spouses, partners. So we're always interacting with someone else, and maybe we're giving advice or something like that. So if we know a little bit more about verbal behavior and how verbal behavior works, we can do things a lot better. Maybe we can sort of save the world through behavior analysis, as some people have said, Dick Malott in particular. So that's the kind of important contribution, I think, that behavior analysis can make. There's a lot of research that's going on now about verbal behavior. I try to keep up with it, and particularly having to do with equivalence. There are some sort of spin-offs that in the areas of instruction and how you can just use this in instructional technology. There are clinical applications of how to maybe help people with if they have adjustment problems or fears or phobias, or if they're depressed or something like that. And all of those things are very, very important, and I think the key is understanding verbal behavior. As fond as I am of studying how pigeons peck keys in an operant chamber, which is what I've spent most of my time doing laboratory research on, it clearly is just as important to be able to study human verbal behavior.
So if you had a crystal ball that allowed you to see down the road into the future 50, 100 years from now, what do you think you'd see about behavior analysis? Where would behavior analysis be?
Boy. Well, that's kind of a tricky question, because behavior analysis it's recognized for some things. Obviously, it's recognized for the contributions it can make for maybe helping kids with autism or helping kids with other that maybe have developmental disabilities or other things. So sometimes the public perception is that behavior analysis is only good for maybe special populations or kids that have problems or something like that. It's not really relevant to understanding the sort of the totality of the human condition. I would hope that 50 years from now there would be a broader acceptance of behavior analysis. I'm not exactly sure how to bring that about, or what anyone can do at this point to sort of contribute that. I've just tried to sort of keep chugging along and just keep whatever you do, write articles or talk with people or kind of communicate to others about the field and how it's a promising field and how it will sort of help. It will help society if we gain a better understanding of what it means to be a human, what it means to have interactions with other people, what it means to be a well-adjusted person, and what it means to have meaningful lives and contribute to maybe improving the human condition, maybe not polluting our world so much or kind of exploiting resources. So I would hope that in 50 years we could have that behavior analysis could be recognized as having made a bigger contribution toward that. I don't know how we could bring that about. I know that we talk a lot about that at the convention or in our professional correspondence and our professional meetings. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that, well, if we keep going, maybe we can bring that about. I'm sometimes reminded of this, something called the fallacy of the better mousetrap, that if you, the popular saying is, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will be a path to your door. And that's an interesting saying, but it may not be as valid as we think it is. One of the examples that's used to sort of illustrate that concerns the typewriter. The mechanical typewriters were developed in a way that the layout of the keys was not the optimal arrangement of the keys. If we think about the keys on the typewriter, we have Q, W, E, R, T, Y on our fingers on our left hand. Well, the arrangement of keys in there was deliberately placed so that it would slow down the way we type. If the keys were arranged in a different way than with a mechanical typewriter, the keys would jam. So they designed the typewriter to make it suboptimal. Now, there are optimal ways to arrange the keys, and there's you could probably buy a subroutine for your computer that would do that, that would change that layout of the keys on your computer keyboard. But we haven't done that. We've kind of stuck with the same old thing, even though it's less than the optimal arrangement for the keys. So just because something is better doesn't always mean that it's going to be adopted or that it will become the culturally accepted way of doing things. So behavior analysis is going to have to kind of keep plugging along, it seems to me, to try to meet its goals. We can say that we have a good technology for doing X, Y, or Z, but we may, just like even though we have a better technology for doing something, it's just like having a better arrangement of keys on the keyboard. That by itself might not do it. We might have to have some other method of persuasion to sort of convince people of the value of behavior analysis. And I think we're all looking for that. I hope that someone will find that in the next few years, so that 50 years from now we'll be playing a greater role in contributing to human welfare.
I'm going to throw in a new question that you haven't seen before. Do you think that for behavior analysis as a discipline to survive, as opposed to, let's say, a practice or a technology or whatever, do you think it will be necessary to get scholars in other disciplines on board, or to somehow find a way of becoming accepted as a philosophical, theoretical, conceptual, experimental practice?
Yes, I do think that's important. I think it's a really good idea that the association, ABAI, has these guest speakers who come in from these other disciplines who talk about their research. They may not be all that familiar with behavior analysis, but it's important to show, well, it's important to invite these people to our meetings and to make contact with them and to introduce them to the field, and so that they maybe get some familiarity with our field and the breadth of the things that go on here. I know that when I was president, I invited a neuroscientist from Brown University who was in the process of developing a technology to assist people who had an injury, like a spinal cord injury, through a computer interface that you could read their brain waves, and that would in turn send signals to a computer, and that would operate a robotic arm. It's always struck me as, I mean, that neuroscientist didn't know a great deal about behavior analysis, but what he was doing was very much in keeping with a lot of the sort of philosophical ideas that Skinner's had about how behavior works. And so that's always struck me as being the kind of thing that's useful for behavior analysis to do. So we have in our professional meetings, as in the annual conventions, we have scholars from fields, neuroscientists, anthropology, philosophers. So I think that that's a very important consideration in sort of spreading our field and introducing ourselves to others and helping other people understand what we're all about and how we can make contributions. I think that's a very important thing for the association to do, or any kind of a professional meeting, whether it's a regional association or a state association, any group of behavior analysts to be able to do that.
I have one last question. What words of wisdom would you like to tell students of the future? Give them your advice. I think it's very important to be a dedicated student and to take as much advantage of the resources that are available to you as a student, to take as much advantage of those resources as you can. I don't see that there's a lot of competition among students. It's not in any of the programs that I'm familiar with. It's not, students aren't competing with each other like that. I don't think it's very helpful to have students compete with each other. In the past, I know that some programs were like that. It's not that advisors would play off students against the other, but there was kind of a subtle sort of competitive aspect to things. I see a lot more sort of collaboration and group effort that goes on, and for the most part, the programs that I'm familiar with are very congenial and supportive. The faculty are supportive of students and the student endeavors. The students do have to be dedicated. The faculty are dedicated toward behavior analysis, otherwise they wouldn't be there and be faculty. So it is important that students recognize that, particularly for faculty, there are limitations on the kind of time that they have available. So just because a faculty member maybe doesn't have the time to turn around comments on an article or a draft of an article or something like that, doesn't mean that the faculty member regards that student as any less important or the work as any less important. So if the students can sort of just keep working, understand that everybody's sort of working on the same project,
working toward the betterment of humans and working toward contributing to human welfare and working toward advancing the field of behavior analysis. And always keep that as the sort of the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you very much. Jay Moore.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.